welcome to the latest episode of Estranged. We're super excited to have another guest on today. We are talking to Ben Burgis. Ben is the author of a number of books, most recently Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left with Zer0 Books. You contributed to, is it Madness and Mayhem, Mayhem and Madness?
Myth and Mayhem.
Myth and Madness. Mayhem probably says something about me interpreting Jordan Peterson, which looks at the work of Jordan Peterson. Yeah. And then most recently, your book coming out, also with Zer0 Books, is, you'll have to remind me of the wording.
Canceling comedians while the world burns, critique the contemporary left, yeah.
Well, I think that's like a perfect sort of like summary of a lot of the issues we face right now. A lot of kind of distraction mechanisms going on, a lot of, and we were just talking about this before we pressed record, a lot of sort of riding on the coattails of originally quite well motivated and potentially left-wing concepts, and using those to really now stifle the kind of key issues at hand that are really the issues of the left. We were going to talk today in particular about the Dave Chappelle special from last year, Sticks and Stones, which I really enjoyed watching again yesterday. So do you want to talk to us a little bit? Oh, sorry.
Just quickly, it's funny that we're going to do that one because I think today a new stand-up special came out from Chappelle.
Oh, really?
So that would have been, that would have been good to.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Do that one instead, yeah.
Well, I haven't watched or listened to that yet, but I am looking forward to it. I think that. Honestly, I think that everything that he's done in the last couple of years has been very good, right? I think that there's been like a lot of discourse about like how he's declined, but I think that says more about the way that maybe some viewers or listeners have changed than the way that his shtick has changed.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the things that sort of, I think things that are really ideological questions about things that suddenly become unacceptable to you. I mean, it's different. It's difficult to distinguish between like what you actually like and what you dislike, and what is something that is sort of like the contemporary cope of whatever egregious material conditions exist. You know, is affecting what you see. I mean, we talk a little bit about like the concept of gaze. You know, what is actually what you actually see, and what is actually like your field of vision determined by ideological kind of lenses through which you see the world. But do you want to talk to us a little bit about why you were motivated to write this most recent book?
Yeah, so the book that's Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, which the title is taken from the subject of the first chapter, and it's also used for the title since, you know, it's vivid and it alliterates. But it's the larger subject of the book is the way that in my view, you know, the left, with which I obviously strongly identify, has gotten into a lot of bad habits over the course of the last several decades, where in countries like the US and the UK, even you know, social democrats like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn have spent the vast majority of their careers like way out on the fringes of mainstream politics. And anything more radical than that just seemed utterly impossible. You know, Margaret Thatcher, you know, Tina, there is no alternative. And in that era, I think it got very easy to start thinking of left politics just purely as taking a kind of moral stand against all of the horrible stuff that's going on. So like, I love Noam Chomsky, but if you read Chomsky, there's never a point where he stops to consider, okay, well, what if a socialist government took power in the United States? Then how would it handle, you know, this foreign policy thing, whatever? Because that just wouldn't be a question that would even arise, because he's writing at a time when that would have just seemed completely impossible. And I think that's understandable, but my worry is that a lot of the bad habits that kind of come out of that are, I think, both a symptom of that long exile from real world power and a contributing factor to its continuation, are really undermining us now that things have finally started to change a little bit. And so the larger subject is that kind of counterproductive left moralism, and one part of it, right? The part that's in that's the hook in the opening chapter, and that the title is drawn from, has to do with the way that a lot of, certainly in the United States, a lot of leftists and progressives have this very weird way of really moralizing and treating as if it were very politically weighty what people say in stand-up comedy specials, which the more you think about it, the stranger that is, right? But I think that what I argue in that chapter is that there are kind of two halves of this, that one side of the coin, the one that's more relevant, I guess, what we're going to be talking about today with Sticks and Stones, is like critiquing the premise of some riff in a stand-up special as if it were an essay that were published in Jacobin. And then the other half is, well, the other half I think is best seen by stuff like how excited liberals got about the John Oliver Drumpf thing from 2016, or like about 4 years before that, the march that he and Jon Stewart did in Washington, the rally to restore sanity, where you literally had thousands of people who were going to Washington, D.C., not for an anti-war protest or anything like that, but because their favorite news comedians told them to. And there's something very strange about that. And I think both cases, there's a kind of confusion about what comedy is and what it's for. And I think that the underlying thing has to do with this habit of seeing politics as a kind of moral performance, and thinking that maybe just the pure force of your indignation with the injustices of the world will somehow correct those injustices. And there's a sort of heartbreakingly earnest version of this fantasy, which you get from like The West Wing, if you've watched that, where President Bartlett will just literally reduce the Republicans to shamed silence by the power of his eloquence. And then there's the version of it, there's the comedy version of it, right, which sees the role of comedian as the kind of court jester who can tell the king that the peasants are starving. But the problem with that, of course, is that the king already knows peasants are starving. If he cared, he wouldn't get to be the king in the first place. You're much better off just organizing the peasants themselves into a movement for land reform. But I think that as far as the specific subject of its effects on comedy, I think that you tend to get something really bad. And I actually think that this special we're going to be talking about today is an honorable exception to this. But when comedians do touch on these subjects, it tends to go really wrong in one or two ways. And I guess that's the last thing I'll say, right? Which is just that either you get this kind of cloying, performatively woke comedy that is sort of that's catering to this reaction and seems, to be more designed to elicit what's sometimes called clapter than laughter. That you're not really, like I'm sure you can think of comedians whose bits seem to be designed not so much to inspire people to laugh or to think, right, but as too much as to inspire them to Yas Queen, right? So that's one way that it goes very wrong. And then the other way that it goes very wrong is that it creates an opening for just like the laziest possible anti-woke comedy. Which we're pretty much drowning in now, because the same way that I think, the same way that in like 2005 maybe, the sort of go-to thing for a lot of comedians was doing this sort of George Carlin-esque anti-religious thing, during the New Atheism era. The same way now, I think that oh my God, why can't anybody tell a joke anymore is the lazy go-to. For a lot of comedians, and because there's an audience that appreciates that, it kind of disguises stuff that's not particularly good, right? Because it because they're getting their version of Yas Queen, for like telling off the PC mob or whatever, and either way, it's not going to produce particularly thought-provoking or particularly funny material.
Absolutely. I
Do
mean,
you
I think
think
that
that,
analogy with, sorry, do you want to go for it, Adrian?
no, just really quick. Do you think that stand-up comedy is even an art form that within its possibilities is subverting the norm, or is it really something? A lot of comedians say that comedy is dead and it's not something that can come back. Some of them say that it's because of like the censorship, and you can't say a lot of things that used to be considered funny. But mostly just like as a form, do you think that it's something politically viable? Because you have all these different types of comedy now that are different than stand-up comedy, like podcasting.
Mm.
I'm thinking of like Cumtown, which is like
Mhm.
extremely sort of like on PC. And at some point they were making like $50,000 a month. Um, yeah, it's crazy. Do you think that like stand-up comedy is something that can still even have like swaying power when it comes to like the social political sphere?
Well, I mean, this kind of gets down to what it's for, because I think that when you talk about swaying power, like the idea that somebody is going to be convinced that their ideas are wrong and that they should think something else instead, or in like the really like black and white versions of this, that they should, I don't know, like vote the other way or something like that, right? Like, I think that strikes me as a job that stand-up comedy is very poorly equipped to do, and always has been, right? That I don't think it really, I don't think it really does that, or at least not enough, to invest a lot of hope in it. I think that at its best, I mean, at its best, it is an art form, right? Which is to say, roughly, right? That like, I mean, the distinction between entertainment and art is fuzzy, obviously, but like, but that something, I guess I'd roughly think of that as a form of entertainment that doesn't just entertain, right? But also has some kind of depth to it, makes you think about things in a slightly different way, has all of that stuff, right? Like, has some sort of insight that's attached to it. And I think at its best, it can do that. But I think that it's not so much a matter of, I think good art, that's political. If we're not just talking about, I mean, I think there's a kind of good art that's political, that's preaching to the choir political, right? Making like folk songs for protests and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think comedy is very bad for that role, right? But I think there's nothing wrong with that. But otherwise, I think what political art can do is not so much change people's minds as just kind of make them see things at a little bit of a right angle that might make them think differently. But it's not an essay, right? There's no there's no thesis that's being argued for, or if there is, it's probably terrible comedy.
Absolutely. I mean, I kind of think that the role of art is to not reduce contradiction to opposition, but rather
Mm-hmm.
to bring contradiction to the foreground. And I think, talking about, I really like your analogy with Christianity and atheism, and essentially, that's, with the woke and anti-woke. And essentially the truth lies elsewhere, as in like, why do we believe what we believe? What material conditions are leading people to believe one thing or the other? Or what truth is spoken by this belief? And I also kind of, talking about this idea of morality, I had never really thought about, the left being in exile for so long, and that kind of turn to morality, because it essentially like appeals to morality are important when there is no alternative but some like horrible Reaganite, Thatcherite, like obviously exploitative system. But of course, we have bootstrapping is a phenomenon within capitalism, and of course, morality bootstrapping can be another form. And what a great way to distract from material conditions when you focus on morality over materialism. So I mean, but I really think this idea of pointing to contradiction rather than overcoming it with
Yeah.
opposition, goodies and baddies, is what art is for. And I think this is what the Dave Chappelle special does.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that maybe gets to, in what Adrian was talking about earlier, the kind of germ of truth in the extremely overblown complaints about how, oh, you can't say anything anymore, you can't make a joke, whatever, right? That obviously on some level that's clearly false, right? If you listen to lots of stand-up, right, you'll find tons of people who are coasting off of easy laughs from like, from from just being as offensive as possible, right? There's lots of that stuff out there, right? But I think that the germ of truth in it is that it reduces the space to play with ambiguity. That that I think a lot of times comedy is at its best when you're just living with the contradiction, right? That you're not trying to like really push very hard in a particular direction. You're just kind of milking humor out of the like absurdity of some tension, within something, right? And so I think that the germ of truth in the self-censorship complaint is that there is then a lot of pressure just sort of to reduce contradiction to opposition, to just pick a side and either like aggressively cater to one audience or another, rather than playing with an audience's discomfort and finding the humor like within the points of opposition.
And I think this is the thing with this reducing. I was, this is what I think is happening on the woke side to some extent, and it's potentially not surprising that both Harry Potter is used as an artistic analogy for all kinds of political things, and also why J.K. Rowling, who potentially, I don't want to, death of the author or that, like say what's in her mind, but there is a sort of like morality play in this versus that, and women versus trans, that she has become caught up in a because I think it's the same mode of thinking, but in a different direction. But so this opposition created out of contradiction and good versus bad. Then this is, I think, the element of truth where the anti-woke comes in, where I think to many people's mind, this reduction of good versus bad, this group is good, this group is inherently bad, there's an essentialism here, this group does this group is essentially that is, to my mind, racist, in that it is essentializing rather than, and it's almost Orientalist in the sense that this group cannot be made fun of because they're particularly fragile or they're particularly angelic. Whereas again, in Sticks and Stones, Dave Chappelle, shows that actually to be human is to be able to be bad and to be able to be immoral. And that's the whole kind of messiness of life. And we all as humans have the right to be human. And I think, the bit where he's talking about the alphabet people is, an example of this. It's funny. It's making light of something, of everything has an absurd element. And everybody gets to be not just some fragile, frozen angel marble statue that is devoid of any human characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, really, like, I think one of the funny things about this album is that he starts out by doing some things that, like, especially rewatching it, I thought were, like, really obviously meant to signal, like, what's coming and what light you should see it in. But seems like a lot of people, like, I don't know, like it seemed like he was really kind of spelling it out almost, but nonetheless, right? I mean, like, reading the reviews of it, never mind any of the tweets about it, and you'll see that lots of people did not at all see it in the light that he was going out of his way to say, look, here's what I'm up to and what follows, right? Like, so how does he start out? He starts out talking about Anthony Bourdain and his friend with the messed up life, and so that's that exact thing that you were just saying, right? That you're allowed to be broken, you can get through it, right? That I mean, hey, this guy never thought about killing himself, for a second, which is both funny and also really highlights what's about to come. And then the second thing that he does is he says, oh, I never do impressions, but I'm going to do 2 impressions. The first, they're not going to be very good. I'm going to do them. The first one is the founding fathers of the United States of America. And it's, hurry up and finish writing that Constitution N-word, right? And then the second one is of his impression, which is very drawn out and, very funny, and he does it very well, right? But like his impression of like the audience getting mad about the jokes. And it seems like a lot of people kind of, they honed in on the second part, but they completely miss the point of, okay, why is there the first part there, right? Why does he start out with the founding fathers before he does the joke about the overly sensitive audience? And it seems pretty clear that what he's doing is like the first joke, right, is reminding people, hey, I'm still Dave Chappelle. Remember, you know, I'm the guy who did the joke, who did the show where there were all the jokes about, you know, Bush lying about weapons of mass destruction and reparations and, you know, like all that stuff, right? Like, I'm coming at you from this, yeah, very irreverent, but like basically progressive worldview. And you people are ridiculous, right? You know, like, and it really seems like, and that especially when you get to stuff like that alphabet people joke later, you know, about the L's and the G's and the B's and the T's, and the Q's, sorry. He even says, right, like, I mean, I don't know, like it's so weird, you know, that like so many people manage to hear that as, oh, here's Dave Chappelle saying that, like, you know, he doesn't like, you know, gay and trans people, you know, but it's like, well, hold on. In the bit, right, he talks about how the journey, right, that the car is on is, is escaping from oppression and discrimination. I mean, do you think Dave Chappelle thinks oppression and discrimination are good things? You know, like that was really off-brand. You know, I mean, like the point, you know, the point of it, you know, I mean, that he's, you know, I mean, he's playfully exploring what he sees as the like tension points within this. But I mean, it's from, you know, but it's from a position of being, you know, of being basically sympathetic, you know, of saying that, yeah, of course, right, you know, this is civil rights struggle. Civil rights struggles are good things.
But he's also highlighting the fact that there's tension inside the car. Like there's contradiction inside the car, and they don't like each other at some point, and
yeah, that's absolutely.
Yeah, they think that the bi person is like gross or whatever. Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about like the power to sway, I wasn't so much talking about like convincing people to like vote for a certain party or whatever. I mean, you can have like fucking Amy Poehler and Mayor Rudolph like together with, who was it, like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, and I mean, that's, maybe they'll crack a couple of jokes here and there, but that's not really going to sway anybody. To me, what the political sort of potential of stand-up comedy is a sort of like a comfort with cynicism, especially now that I think there's this overly positive, like corporate sort of, I don't know, like tendency to want to turn everything into a safe space, and everything needs to be like happy and everybody needs to get along. Stand-up comedy, to me, like the social political sway that it has is it's to cultivate, yeah, like cynicism, a little bit of nihilism here and there. And I think that, yeah, maybe it's that's where its value is for me. But I see myself getting that from other places other than stand-up comedy.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think in some ways you can have the same discussion about like like literary novels, right? You know, what are the things that we get out of, you know, of reading literary novels? Can you get many of those same things from other art forms? And I'm sure the answer is yes, right? Like that. I mean, I think that. I mean, I don't particularly, you know, I'm a fan of the form, but I mean, I don't particularly think that somebody who never listens to stand-up comedy is living a deprived life, you know, and they're, you know, and they're missing depths and, you know, and riches that, you know, that they have no other way of getting into their life. You know, I think that it's one particular way of being entertained in a way that at its best is insightful and thought-provoking. But it certainly, you know, it certainly isn't the other way, as you said before. You know, there are other forms of comedy, even, you know, that have emerged that, you know, that lots and lots of people are getting many of those same things from. But I guess what I'm, you know, I think my quarrel isn't particularly with the person who says, you know, it's not my thing, right? You know, as with the person who somehow it is their thing, right? Like they're even. they're even doing things like writing reviews of a special for Slate or Jezebel, whatever, and they'll do these bizarre things like when Dave Chappelle says, I'm a victim blamer. When I heard about Michael Jackson, my first thought was, what were these kids wearing? Like that somehow they'll not only think but say, write down, and their editors will approve them saying that, oh, he was like trying to be edgy by taking a shot at Michael Jackson's victims. Like,
absolutely. There's a couple of things actually talking about.
I understand you're listening to comedy, but yes, go on.
No, I just this whole thing of something that originally has a certain intention and becomes capitalized upon and transformed into something else. I always find this like reading intentions of people. Adrian and I are really into psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalysis in general. And it's funny how like this weaponized, capitalized upon form of kind of therapy in the so-called subconscious. I mean, Jordan Peterson being an example, I think he misuses terms. He calls himself a psychoanalyst, but like, I've heard him use that one once, and it's like, well, that literally not at all. He's like a theory of depth psychology, let's just say. But there's kind of like certain ideas, like the discovery of Freud of the unconscious, and how it's become this kind of, in a lot of kind of common parlance, this facile reading of, you can interpret exactly what somebody's thinking because they say something. If they say something, and again, this essentializing. And in psychoanalysis, like if you go through psychoanalytic therapy, it takes years and years and years, precisely because any signifier can literally mean any signified for any person. It can be like one thing that happened to one person as a child. A swan might represent this, and it might represent, something else for somebody else. And it takes years and years and years and years to unpack. We're also like self-alienated subjects. We don't even know what the fuck we even think. So it's kind of like reading into things of like, oh, he said this, therefore his unconscious or his unconscious system of this is this, or his belief is that. But I really think there's a few examples in this special where Dave Chappelle is really right on about like how capitalism works. The first one is the example that you said at the beginning of the Anthony Bourdain versus his very pathetic friend who was a scholar at Harvard and then became like a shop assistant at Foot Locker. And Anthony Bourdain had all of the trappings of capitalism, the sleeping with hot women, the most amazing job of going around the world, eating food, being a total cool guy. And that cannot, that basically the fallacy essentially that success, fame, money, accumulation brings happiness. And there was another example that I thought was really, it's something that we essentially, still on some level often believe. There was another example that I thought was just really, really smart about how the way capitalism functions. And I can't remember what it is right now, but I know you mentioned it before when you gave the example. I was like, oh yeah, that's a funny point of, that essentially we're in this kind of very egregious, rampant, exploitative system of accumulation that, certain moral copes, justification mechanisms that in the past might have been religion under feudalism, have disappeared, and potentially there are other kinds of justification mechanisms now, of which certain moralistic ideologies are some.
For sure. I think certainly like one thing that I didn't mention, right, but it's kind of along the same lines, is the part of the special where he starts talking about the opioid and heroin epidemic and where it's in Ohio, which by the way, my mother grew up in Youngstown. I still have family members who live there, and I laughed very hard about the thing, as Ohio, which I believe is a Cherokee word for poor white people, and he starts to talk about about heroin addicts, and the joke actually, again, like structurally it's very similar to the joke about Michael Jackson's victims, is that he now understands how white people felt during the crack epidemic, because he doesn't care about this either. So it's the same deal, right? That like he's because again, if you're going to do the sort of like 1982 Romanian censor level like literalness that some people did with the Michael Jackson joke, I guess they go, oh my God, that's terrible, right? He doesn't care about them. But it seems like you know, at the very least, what he's playing with in Milk and Humor from is this thing about like communalist identifications,
Mm-hmm.
you know, making people, you know, indifferent to like the ravages of poverty and social decay.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure.
I just realized the other example was about the kids and Michael Jackson,
Yes,
because he
that's right.
talks about it in capitalist terms. You know, he kind of says, you know, at least you got, you know, I mean, obviously it's a very edgy joke.
Oh
but,
yeah, yeah. Lots of,
know,
you know, if lots of people, I'm sure some people in this audience were molested, but I wasn't by no Michael
was
Jackson.
like Jackson, and sort of,
Yeah.
the idea that I mean, that's essentially how a lot of this abuse happens, is because of the economic systems that we live in. And yeah, I just thought it was a very clever joke. But yeah,
I love the like, I'm not a pedophile, but if I was, Macaulay Culkin would be the first kid I fuck. No, I was gonna say, Ben, what do you? I mean, we were just talking about this before you logged on, and what is the actual power or authority of woke people online? And I mean, of course, it's undeniable. Some people have been greatly affected by sort of like this cancel culture, but do you think that maybe you were mentioning Chomsky,
Yeah.
and he wrote a book in the 80s on manufacturing consent, and
Yeah.
sometimes I think that the discourse, or what gets introduced into the symbolic order, like Helen was talking about, you know, it's almost not like it's introducing a signifier into the symbolic order, but a master signifier, in the sense that people just assume that it's sort of like the leading idea in the symbolic order. And this would be the second joke that you were talking about, of Chappelle saying that I'm going to do an impression of someone, and then actually somebody yells like, "Oh, it's Trump," but he's like, "No, that's you guys. It's the audience." And it's do you think that people are actually really like that? Do you think that people actually get like offended that easily, or are most people just like, "No, it's funny and I don't care"? And does he sort of like miss the mark, and is he adding to that sort of like manufacturing of a master signifier, in which like you know, you start to believe actually that people are very sensitive like that, instead of just a few people on Twitter that, you know, are just like, they're basically just like, you know, calling out people, not because they're leftists, but because that's the kind of people that they are.
Yeah, so I guess maybe to start at the very end there, I think that it's not just because it's not primarily because they're leftist part is absolutely right. I think that what we now tend to call cancel culture, and you know, I usually use that term because I generally prefer to like use whatever term is generally used and fight about the underlying ideas rather than fight about the words. But it's I think one of the, I guess to go back to something you said earlier, one of the things that's slightly annoying about it is that because that's the term that's generally used now, it kind of leads to all these questions about, okay, but are people really canceled? What does it even mean to be
It's
canceled?
really charged already.
Yeah. And so I kind of like, I remember back in like 2015, the phrase was call out culture, which, you know, seems kind of anachronistic now, but like I think was a more accurate term for the same phenomenon, because even though lots of people do suffer, you know, financial harm, certainly as a result of this stuff, and there are even cases of people who commit suicide as a result of it. For the most part, right? I think that's not the biggest part of what we're talking about. I think that what's roughly called cancel culture is a tendency that I tend to think is not just on the left. I think it's a disease of, you know, whatever you want to say, neoliberalism, or what we could maybe optimistically call late capitalism, that infects the entire political spectrum, which comes from the fact that we live in this neoliberal hellscape where people are incredibly atomized and they often feel most connected to other people online, and also the fact that the technology itself, like social media platforms, are intentionally designed. You know, this is not exactly a state secret. You know, I think this is part of what that new movie, The Social Dilemma, you know, is part of it, what it's about, right? That that these are owned by for-profit corporations and they're designed to be as addictive as at all possible. That's the goal. And part of how they're addictive is that they give you all these instant feedback mechanisms, like likes and retweets and all that stuff, that give people instant validation for doing things to achieve clout within a certain group, or especially to help define the boundaries of that group. And I think, and then I guess also a third thing is the fact that, at least in the United States, which obviously cancel culture, call out culture, whatever you want to call it, is very far from being limited to the United States, but this is certainly the epicenter of it. Most people work in non-unionized at-will employment workplaces, so that gives an extra charge or edge to a lot of this stuff, because a lot of people are very worried about being fired for things taken out of context, etc., because they can be fired without any sort of process or appeal. And so all of those factors, I think it infects the entire political spectrum. I think, like, if you read John Ronson's book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which came out in
2015?
Yes, 2015. It's certainly before the phrase cancel culture was invented, but it's very much about that. And in there, like, one of his main examples is actually from the right. It's about Lindsay Stone, who worked for an organization called Life, working with adults with learning disabilities, and she and her friend and coworker Jamie, while they're on their off hours, they would often take kind of jokey and irreverent pictures of each other and post them on Facebook, like things like smoking in front of a non-smoking sign, things like that. And one of them was they're at the Arlington National Cemetery, and Jamie takes a picture of Lindsay going, pretending like she's shouting in front of a sign that says "Silence and Respect," and she thought that, of course, she was posting this to her, however many 100 people or whatever she was friends with on Facebook, but somehow the picture got out, and there were all the same things you see in pile-ons by progressives, that there was a Fire Lindsay Stone Facebook group with 20,000 likes, and she was fired, and her life was impacted in various other ways, which just goes to the point that it's not unique to the left. I think that when combined with the more specific pathologies of the left, I think it can add up to something that's really toxic, that really alienates a lot of potentially persuadable people, but it's not at all unique to the left. And as far as how much power it really has, I think it really depends what you mean. I think that oftentimes, oftentimes the stuff does succeed in getting people in certain kinds of jobs fired. Oftentimes, because I think we saw a lot of this in the post-George Floyd moment in the United States, that if you're trying to get corporations or political institutions, to change anything meaningful about their practices, that's incredibly hard. But if you just want to get somebody fired from one of those organizations, that's incredibly easy. And so it's a really easy concession that they can give you. Oh, we'll fire this person who said something problematic.
Absolutely.
So it happens a fair amount, right? But that said, I do agree that most times people do things like this. And I take Adrian's point, right? I don't think that most people are necessarily like Chappelle's impression of his audience. The problem is, I think that there are, even if it's a minority, there are enough people who are like that to create a lot of these effects. And I think that there's an effect. I think that there are psychological effects. I think sometimes there are financial effects. But that said, I also think that I totally take Adrian's point. 95% of the time, when people are sort of mob yelling at someone on Twitter, it's just yelling into the void. It doesn't have any real material effect on the world, which, although I think in those cases, the most dangerous thing about it is that it feels like it does. So it scratches the itch to capital D, capital S, do something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult for something like that to sort of materialize into rabble. But ideologically or conceptually, I think it's very easy, and people can just assume that there's millions of people out there that are just woke, But
I think it's conducive for us to imagine that there are. I think it is.
Yeah.
That as you say, like the punishment is acted on a particularist level, and we're so granularized in this like neoliberal one, even more so through our iPhones, and this dividing. I mean, I'm not like a traditionalist in any sense, but like breaking up families, breaking up kind of wider community institutions. Like it's conducive for us to feel as if everyone out there is against us, because capitalism wants us to be. It thrives off particularization and granularization.
No, I think that's right, and like oftentimes. Sure, if there are 100 people who are yelling at you all at once, even though you might step back or when you're thinking back to it later, realize, okay, but that's out of like 20,000 people who saw this, there are like 100 who are furious about it. That's nothing, right? If I run into somebody who saw the thing they're mad about, most likely they'll be like, oh yeah, whatever. I mean, I guess if I'm Dave Chappelle in this scenario, Dave, I loved your special, right? But like, but that said, I also think that that sometimes we are a little too prone to just dismiss. It's like, oh, whatever, right? So some people got mad. I'll log off, go for a run, whatever. Which one is sort of weirdly inconsistent, because I don't think we would do that in other contexts, right? If like 100 people are like piling racist abuse onto someone online, right? Like nobody on the left would or should say, oh, why are you taking this so seriously? It's just online, get over it, right? But then like also more importantly, I think there's also something that, it's very easy to give advice like that. It's very hard to take it. I don't think we're really built to have 100 people yell at us at the same time and not have some kind of psychological effect, especially if, as you say, we're living in this incredibly atomized neoliberal hellscape.
Absolutely. We used in real world conditions, to have a community of X number of people. So 100 people is a lot of people for one person, even if it's 100 out of a million people who viewed it, 100 people is a lot. But the other thing I was going to say is that, there's a lot of cancellation that happens that's totally invisible. For example, somebody who voices a desire to unionize, it's happening at like non-online levels. But I also think this, and this comes to the question of the commons and how tech really fits within capitalism, and how we've had this new industrial revolution that has had terrible effects that we haven't really thought about. And yes, okay, these are private companies. Of course, they're private companies, so they have the right to, people can be deplatformed. It's within their rights. But, these are monopolies that have taken over, and they feel like reality itself. The online world, YouTube, Instagram can feel like the only reality that there is, because it has taken on such massive import in our lives. And there's very few media through which we can express ourselves, So I think we are very fragile. For sure. In the face of cancellation.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that sense, of that kind of corporate cancellation, like deplatforming, I also think that there's a weird thing that happens where a lot of leftists, when they start talking about this, suddenly they sound like libertarians.
Yeah.
They'll say, oh, this free speech is only about the government, right? It's like the private company, can do what it wants, which is which again, like sounds exactly like a libertarian explaining why the restaurant owner shouldn't have to have the notice on his wall, informing employees about OSHA safety standards, or or anything like that, right? Like that. In practice, of course. I don't think YouTube, for example, necessarily should be, a free for all where you can literally post anything. But but these corporations do control a really absurd amount of the flow of information, and so if you are concerned about free speech, not just as a legal matter, but like but you're concerned with the free exchange of information. Then I think that when you see very few decision makers empowered to make decisions about what millions of people will or will not see, oftentimes with extremely fuzzily defined rules and no real process for like, okay, exactly why did this get taken down? Can I appeal it? Then I think that it's legitimate to find that disturbing.
And I think it's interesting you point out that libertarian question, because I think, there are, first of all, I think there's a lot of fuzziness in terms of what the terms mean. But I guess the difference between a libertarian and a leftist would be like, and it's not okay, or, you know, or let's look at the reasons how this has happened, or
Right.
let's try to work to change it. But, you know, for sure, there's a lot of people calling themselves leftists, which I kind of do use this principle of contradiction versus opposition. And then when you kind of read it in a certain, or, you know, maybe a more Marxist lens, it's like, hang on, this is you're totally on the side of capital, you know, so
Yeah.
it's really hard to kind of, and even, you know, obviously in the most facile way, the liberal, you know, liberal left and everything, and the Democrats versus the Republicans, you know, it's sort of kind of even disheartening to even be able to like begin to express a critique of this very muddled system we live in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think that oftentimes people will, like, if so much of your engagement with politics is about trying to see bad people punished, because which I think is something that happens for all the reasons we've already talked about, that, you know, again, that's what feels like a realistic victory that you could have, right? You know, that like, to the point that I remember, like, when Rush Limbaugh got his cancer diagnosis, you know, I saw some people, you know, celebrating on left Twitter in this way that would make you think that, like, I don't know, Clear Channel had taken away Rush Limbaugh's show and was going to like reassign it to Sam Seder or something, which would actually be some sort of left victory. It's like, no, this is just like life, that, you know, that, yeah, people get old and they get sick and they die, and then they're replaced with like fresh new conservative blowhards. You know, that's not any kind of like progress or victory.
Absolutely.
But like, when you just really want to see the bad people punished, or even if you can't punish them, you at least want everybody to performatively agree with you about how bad they are, then oftentimes people will just reach for whatever justifies that in the moment, even if it doesn't really fit with what they would normally think ideologically, right? So just as we're recording this today on Friday, right, something I just saw in you know, in Michigan, where I'm from, right, there were just these 13 militia people who were arrested for plotting to kidnap the governor. And Walter Bragman, I think, posted something where he like showed a picture of the like ramshackle like house where one of them lived, and he said something about like economic factors playing a role and, you know, causing terrorism. And whatever you think about like that on its merits, one of the strangest reactions I saw was progressives, people who presumably they have no problem in other contexts saying like, yeah, sure, like if you want to reduce crime, you have to reduce poverty, things like that. They're saying, oh, so you're saying that, like, you know, poor people are bad and they become terrorists, you know, like that's you know, that's a terrible thing for you to say, which would sound in nothing so much like, you know, Reagan Republicans dismissing any analysis of crime that had to do with poverty or structural racism. But it's convenient in the moment, because what you do, you don't actually want to stop and think about this. What you want to do is to get everybody to agree with you about how bad the bad people are.
Absolutely. I know. I mean, it's the same with the class reductionism thing, you know, that kind of like broad brush dismissal of something because I haven't really got to the bottom as to why I think that faux phenomenon is in like a kind of a talking point as well. But I mean, a part of me kind of thinks that, you know, we're so disorientated right now. Like, so many changes are happening so rapidly. The economy is obviously getting more and more and more unfair. You know, there's different forms of exploitation that are really well hidden under snazzy text, snazzy marketing. You know, this idea of progressive, you know, I kind of find very odd. It's like we're marching towards some like perfect utopia where nobody's bad, but like, you know, of course we have a system that has not really changed, but has changed in you know, sort of form, but not really in function, you know. And I think that there is certainly, you know, our generation with young millennials, I guess, you know, burdened with huge amounts of debt because certain issues that were already apparent about there not being enough jobs were papered over by the financialization of young people's educations. And so, you know, it's just getting worse and worse and worse, and more and more ridiculous, you know, ideological copes to justify it. And I think people are very sort of confused. And even, you know, when we aren't able to stop and think, or even have the tools to really see what the kind of chains are within our contemporary condition, it's almost like often when we find a tool, people want to remove that tool, or that tool's too challenging, or what if something worse takes its place? I think there's just a lot of, you know, a huge amount of insecurity on various kind of psychological, material levels. And obviously the pandemic's just kind of made it worse. So, yeah.
Do you think that there can be a sort of rehabilitation of rat shaming? Because well, Helen right now was talking about like the difference between like liberals and leftists, and leftists are just kind of like more looking out for workers, looking out for each other if they're working, and liberals are just like, we want to scold the earth into shape. And I was kind of brought up like, don't rat on people. That's not something that you do. There's different ways that you can deal with it, but don't, like, that's not the way to treat like your fellow
Oh
men.
yeah, totally.
Especially to like, structures that could potentially like ruin, like the person. So yeah, I think that, is there enough like rat shaming, and would it even have any traction right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth a shot. If people are being shamed for anything else, it's at least useful to shame them for this. Yeah, but no, I mean, in all seriousness, I agree. I mean, I think it's a really disturbing sign of part of the problem we were talking about earlier, which is that the contemporary left, and sometimes when I make these criticisms, people will say, like, a certain kind of like smart leftist will push back and say, oh, but you're not really talking about the left, you're talking about like liberals. But then my contention would be that there isn't really a sharp dividing line in practice, which is part of the problem. But that the left is more disconnected from any kind of organized working class than it's ever been in history. And I think what you're talking about, Adrian, really gets at the heart of that, because certainly if you think about like, if you were in a structure like a union, the last thing you would ever do is try to get somebody fired, right? Mm-hmm. Like even if they were saying horrible racist shit, and maybe you'd like beat them up in the parking lot or something, but you certainly wouldn't go to the boss and try to get them fired, because that would really just undermine the whole enterprise. Whereas I think because so much of left-wing political energy now is channeled into online interactions between fairly atomized individuals, then it sort of becomes natural that there's no idea of something like a union or a grassroots social movement as a countervailing source of power. So the instinct is often just to try to rat people out to whatever whatever form of authority like seems like it actually is exercising some power, whether that's an employer or YouTube, Twitter, whatever, because because that's what feels like getting something done, even if what's getting done isn't actually anything that's going to do anything to help with the structural problem. All it's going to do is make is have some like random person who did something bad have more trouble paying for his health insurance premiums, and in the process, by the way, probably like radicalizing him into some sort of hardcore conservative because people like you did this to him. Absolutely.
I know, and this is the thing of the fallacy that like these authorities, in a materialist sense, they're not on your side. The person that's on the side is the person that's being ratted out. But it's funny, talked about like granularization and like particularization, and obviously there's an element of something more universal, or a working class led movement, or people seeing things that they have in common. I think a lot of especially with tech and there being fewer jobs, a lot of people potentially from different strata of society have more in common at this moment, and in different moments in time, with people from other strata. But, there's obviously this kind of twee idea of like a universalism, Benetton, everybody, we've got more in common than what we don't. But what we talk about is a more kind of like dialectical version of materialism, which is like a negative universalism, is like what we share is what we don't share. And I think this is what like comedy can really bring out, like what we share. And I think Zizek talks about this a lot, but like when you're really close with somebody is when you can really take the piss out of them, because you're pointing out that you see within them something they don't have, some kind of gap within them, the comedic gap essentially. And like what we have in common as human beings is this, the form of subjectivity that we all share, which I think comes from essential lack. what is difficult in life. And I think that's a profoundly anti-capitalistic thing, because can you capitalize on nothing? Well, no.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so I think actually we haven't talked about, but this good lead in to probably the thing that most of the hate the special got wasn't even for any of the things that we've talked about. It was for the transracialism joke that where he's saying, oh, having born in a certain sex, growing up in that gender identity, and then have a different one is innately funny. Which by the way, if you watch like the trans YouTuber ContraPoints, I remember she has a video called The Darkness, where she says exactly the same thing, right? That this is an innately funny situation, and just because, again, there's that tension, right? And then what he says, I think, was sort of taken as somewhat understandably, I think, because a lot of people have heard variations of this so many times that they sort of read it into whatever they hear. But it was taken as a kind of like attack helicopter joke, right? Which I don't actually think was at all the point, right? Because when he compares he compares that to him, him saying that he was going to be identify as an Asian person, and then he does with reference to his wife, this sort of like schlocky caricature, of an Asian person, and I don't think that was really the point. I think the point has more to do with something actually we've seen a lot. For some reason, we've seen like several cases of, like, just in the last couple months, which is what the phenomenon of like Rachel Dolezal, Jess LaBarbera, Jessica Krug type cases of people who, well, the way it would usually be thought of, right, is that they're really white, but they're pretending, or they've spent their lives pretending to be black. And it seems like what the joke is really playing up. I mean, I think, first of all, this kind of goes back to like a stand-up comedy special is not an essay, right? There's no thesis you're arguing for, but the tension he's exploring is between how we think about those cases and how we think about gender. And of course, if you were going to come to a conclusion, one conclusion you could come to is the socially conservative one, that it would be clearly absurd to be transracial, therefore nobody's really transgender. But I don't think that's the only conclusion you could come to on the basis of noticing that uncomfortable tension in the views that a lot of us have about these things, right? You could resolve that tension in tons of different directions, and certainly I think at its best, one thing that could get us to think more about is why we're in the business of, as people with any kind of left political perspective, one thing presumably that we should all agree on is that race, racial categorizations don't track some like magical essential feature of human beings, and so so we could look at this and say, okay, well, sure, there are all kinds of differences between these cases, but there's something really funny. There's something that like maybe we want to think twice about the instinctive reaction that a lot of people have to the Rachel Dolezal sorts of cases of like outrage at like misreporting one's racial category, and think, well, no, maybe, like maybe this is, of course it's not the same thing insofar as, all human societies that have ever existed, people have sorted themselves in some way that roughly corresponds to sex, and probably will continue, to do so. Whereas, race is a very recent, historical innovation, and so it might be more plausible to think that we'll at some point in the future, actually, make reality the sort of dumb right-wing thing about claiming not to see color, that we will at some point in the future cease to categorize ourselves this way. But whatever's true about that, right? I think the larger issue is this is a real tension that he's locking onto, right? I mean, this is like, this is a real place where a lot of people with, you know, to use the word that you said earlier for reasons I sympathize with, that you don't like, right? You know, progressive, you know, views about these things. A lot of people with those progressive views are kind of pulled in a couple of different directions on these cases. And whatever your conclusion about how we actually should think about them, surely it shouldn't be off limits to, in the context of a comedy special, try to milk humor from the tension and the discomfort.
Absolutely. And but the thing is, you know, you're talking about like the tension is very productive, and it is interesting because often, you know, that tension being papered over in various ways, and you hear this kind of, you know, someone's identity is not up for debate, etc., which, you know, absolutely. But the idea is that, you know, that things like drag have always played with the tension, you know, of this kind of like, well, we have this arbitrary biological sex difference, but obviously it doesn't track neatly. And so, but yeah, I mean, there are like productive ways of kind of sending things up. I have to say, I don't know about you, Adrian, I found the bit that I found most funny in the special was the Jussie Smollett bit.
Oh.
I don't really know. I don't know if it's his delivery and he's saying the French actor Jussie Smollett, but I mean, that's something kind of what we're just talking about, kind of, I think maybe, you know, similar themes at play. But that was, it was, you know, it was quite funny. You know, he's talking about the Nigerian race, the people playing the character of the racist being Nigerian, and he does a kind of a Nigerian accent, you know, with various like racial slurs. No, I thought that was a very funny bit. I don't know if you have any insights about that joke in particular.
Oh, yeah. Well, me? Sorry,
Well,
did you say me?
Either of you guys.
You go ahead. You go.
No, about that. I don't. Oh, man, I watched the special yesterday, but I think I cut off right before getting to that part. But I remember it from. But yeah, he was kind of saying like, I'm not gonna call you that, you know, if you were faking the whole thing. It's just like the last thing you can tell me is just I need to call you Juicy Smollett or whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, the funniest part about it was that I thought, right, the way it sets it up, right, you know, because it's again, he's playing with these with this, like, the same way with the alphabet people joke, right? You know, it's about the way that you know, I mean, he's kind of like sending up that phrase LGBTQ, right? You know, that like, which again, I think is inherently funny, right? You know, that this sort of like having like the that sort of style of politics, right? Having this increasingly long abbreviation, you know, to cover all bases. That is funny, right? You know, like you can sympathize with, support all of these civil rights struggles and still find that funny. And similarly, he's the same way that he's talking about ways that people who are incorporated in that increasingly clunky label, right, you know, might have, you know, points of tension within the coalition. He's doing the same kind of thing there, right? Because he says, oh, when this gay black actor was allegedly attacked, then, you know, a lot of people in the gay community were saying, you know, black community is, you know, why aren't you being supportive of this? You're being silent. Is like, we are being supportive by not saying anything, you know, the joke being that like everybody could tell that this was just obviously nonsense, that like walking around this like super liberal neighborhood of Chicago, there are these guys in MAGA hats who just happen to be carrying around ropes and kerosene, you know, getting ready to, you know, oh, and they all watch Empire, so they recognize them.
Yeah, exactly. That was very funny, actually. Yeah, like the kind of people who'd watch. Yeah, exactly. No, it's very, very good.
I wanted to ask you something, Ben. Is that if there's something that we can count on is people's sort of dissatisfaction, and that's why sort of like utopia is for babies, you know. Believing in a utopia is just ridiculous because people, because of unconscious sort of like desire or like the enigmatic nature of sexuality, satisfaction is basically the last thing that people want. And there's this sort of like unification of like people that are on the side of identity politics and capitalism. Like I just saw a few tweets today, like JP Morgan Chase says it will extend billions in loans to Black and Latino home buyers and small businesses owners, in an attempt to like break down systems of like racial oppression or the economic inequality. And then like Yelp said that they were gonna start like paying more attention to reports of racist conduct, and it was gonna start doing like like giving a mark or a label to businesses that have been accused of like racist behavior. When you have like this unification of like who the fuck likes banks, right? And who likes like review sites this much that they're gonna be allies like perpetually. I think, I don't know. My hunch is that people are just gonna get sick of it, and they're gonna like abandon this whole thing of like identity politics. But maybe that's too optimistic. What do you think is gonna happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think what you said about utopia is really true and important. I think as far as like how it plays out specifically with identity politics, maybe I'd be less optimistic, if only because I think that it's so obvious to like, I mean, in a weird way, I think that this kind of like essentialist identitarianism, it's like, I mean, it's almost like thinking about what causes that and how it could go away is like almost a little bit like thinking about like what causes people to vote for Trump and how that could go away, right? That in both cases, not that they're all the same problems necessarily, right? But like people very correctly see that something is very wrong, right? With the world they're living in, and they interpret it in this frame. And I guess I have a hard time seeing people rejecting the frame until they get a better one, right? That like, so for example, right? It's not, I mean, it's not wrong to think that you live in a society that really profoundly doesn't care about you, and that you have a long list of very legitimate complaints. And if you if you don't have some kind of analysis of, well, if you don't have a class analysis of that, then you're going to reach for some other kind of analysis. And this sort of, so for example, right? I mean, if people, I mean, I guess I just think like if people have, like if things like, brutal militarized policing of poor neighborhoods that for historical reasons are disproportionately minority, right? If that's not going away anytime soon, right? Then I think that people who are justly outraged by those things are going to either come up with a better analysis of what the problem is, or they're going to continue to view it in this kind of liberal essentialist, lens that the problem is, where you have this analysis of what's going on there and what can be done about it. That's all about sort of seeing Black people as like a single unit. Like I always loved Toure Reid's point about how there are more Black people in the United States, there are Canadians in Canada. Somehow we would never think there was like a Canadian perspective on anything, because we understand it's a complex society divided into different economic interests and different ideologies and all of those things. But so many, liberals and even leftists can't make the same leap, in the other case, right? So, so in that case, right, and I mean, like, I guess I'm honing in on the case where I think that's it's the most legitimate, but like you have because of how profoundly disturbing the problem that's being reacted to is, but in that case, for example, if it's going to continue to happen and people are going to continue to be outraged about it, and you don't have some sort of like class analysis of what the underlying problem is, then you are going to continue to see it in these sort of race essentialist terms where, this is where, the problem is about, Black people as a unit, and the role of poor white people is to be what's called an ally, and, and how, which you can have very militant versions of it, but then like a lot of mainstream versions that are largely about having difficult conversations,
Yeah.
as tedious,
Sorry, my nephew on the phone there. Sorry about that.
I was wondering, yeah, I heard that. Yeah, so anyway, like all of which is just to say, and then like you could tell equivalent stories about all kinds of other social problems, right? That like I think that if you, that unless there's like a mass outbreak of people having Marxist explanations, these things are going to continue to have liberal explanations of them. Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
I'm pretty pessimistic about that, unfortunately.
There's a nice this nicely ties back to what you were talking about in the beginning, which I think I've read Zizek as well making this point, that there's a deficit in material power that people have. And basically what they're doing is just like supplementing or negotiating with this lack of influence with things that they can do. And ironically, I think that cancel culture is a materialist movement. It might start in a place that is not material, but the ultimate goal is to have like material consequences affecting the people that they want to cancel. But sorry, Helen, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that, of course, like the fewer people seeing seeing these things from a Marxist sense, the more beneficial to capital, which is potentially why capitalism, obviously corporations have sided with identity politics. So it's like a massive tide against which one has to swim, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. Or I think like a lot of that is also just that it's very it's just kind of the path of least resistance, right? Like if you want to do something to signal to the people who are mad at you that they've won some sort of victory, well, the easiest possible way to do that is to stick a sign that says Black Lives Matter in the corner of the screen, because that way you don't have to do anything that might actually mean that you'll start to lose money. And I guess I also did want to go back to Adrian's point about utopia, because I think it's an important one. It's one I think about a lot, right? That I think that even within some versions of the Marxist tradition, there's a tendency to have this kind of like millenarian way of thinking about this stuff, like almost like, I don't know. I remember like not somebody I'm even necessarily a huge fan of, but I remember in the essay finding this really striking, right? There's an old essay by Richard Rorty where he says that as like a young kid involved in this like very socialist milieu in like World War II era New York, he remembers like wondering about like whether like the other kids that bully him would somehow wither away after the revolution, and then there is that tendency that I think is really is really misguided, right? It's like I remember so Freddie DeBoer just came out with this book which I like a lot, called The Call to Smart. I was reading a very critical review of it by Nathan Robinson, who stuff I generally like, but in the review he objected to Freddie using this phrase, the fundamental brokenness of life, because it's like, oh, this is just like conservative pessimism about human nature. Like, okay, I don't think so, right? Like, I think that.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so at all. I think it's the opposite. I think, what do you do with that? But the thing is, I mean, I think Adrian and I really like kind of people who are kind of rereading Marx in a more Hegelian lens, kind of honing in on the contradiction rather than the overcoming, because the overcoming, again, like, I mean, that's what I kind of see capitalism as sort of a form of continual push towards progress through accumulation. And so, it can take various forms that, it doesn't have to be just to do with like money or material creation of things. But yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's like, just because something seems, to foreground a fundamental difficulty of life or fundamental lack or whatever, doesn't mean that it's conservative. I mean, what do you do? Do you say like, yeah, life shit, get on with it, sunshine? You say like, life shit, so let's be more solidaristic,
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Like, I think that, I think, I mean, look, I think that if we're living in, in the 25th century, right? If we're living under, fully automated luxury communism, like people will continue to feel a deep sense of dissatisfaction about their lives, and whether maybe it'll come in some form other than stand-up specials or podcasts like Come Town, but they will also continue to enjoy whoever's producing humor at the expense of that feeling.
And that is
Absolutely.
funny. I mean, like, existential dread is funny, and I think that's what
For sure.
Chappelle was talking about when he was saying that, like, the trans experience is funny, because, like, existentially it's funny. Maybe materially it's not that funny, and
Yeah.
living in a society that is kind of transphobic, definitely it's going to have material consequences that are not that funny, but existentially it is. So yeah, that's a great point. When does the book come out, Ben?
Yeah, the gears of book publishing grind frustratingly slowly sometimes, so it comes out in the spring. But no, that's sorry. I was just still thinking about the stuff about Utopia. But you're right. I think that is a very good ending point.
But yeah, no, thanks so much for coming on, and we really respect what Zer0 Books is doing, and so I think it's just really fantastic, and I know that you've been working a lot with Zer0 Books, so I really want to. I said in an email with you that I find the topic of Jordan Peterson just like so incredibly fascinating what it like represents about the greater dynamics of the society that we're in at the moment. So I will be very excited to read Myth and Madness, not Mayhem and Madness, Myth and oh my god, every time I get the ends of the word, so Myth and Mayhem. But no,
you're turning it into like a Foucault book.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Madness and civilization. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to plug, Ben?
Yeah. So so I think mentioned both of the books that I've written, plus Myth and Mayhem, which I just have a chapter in. Otherwise, it's written by Matt McManus, Marion Trejo, and Conrad Hamilton, and all of whom are worth checking out. And otherwise, guess I just shamelessly plug the podcast, which is called Give Them an Argument, and I guess I will say the book's not coming out until the spring, but there's a article that I wrote for Jacobin a few weeks ago, which in some ways is a preview of, or at least like complements, some of what I say in it, which is a review essay about that John Ronson book we were talking about earlier, So You're Being Publicly Shamed. So it's kind of like a 5 years later, what's changed, how does this hold up things, called So You're Still Being Publicly Shamed.
Awesome. We'll definitely check it out.
We'll be sure to remind people when the book comes out to go and get it.
Really
well, thanks so much for being with us, Ben.
All right, thanks guys.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking. Thanks so much, and thanks for listening.